Professor Adorno, thank you so much for doing this interview. I highly appreciate your work, your research, your teaching over the years. So it is my great honor to have you on the podcast.
Well, it's my great pleasure to be invited. Thank you so much, Mr. Kukina.
Thank you so much. Okay, so shall we start with the questions I prepared for this interview?
Yes.
So basically, what drew you to the field of Latin American literature and colonial studies?
Well, it started with the love of the language, with the love of the Spanish language.
Yes.
And then beyond that, the opportunity to learn about cultural, historical worlds different from my own past and certainly different from my present.
Yes.
That was the source of the fascination.
Yes. Do you have any origin in Latin America or maybe Spain or somewhere else outside the US?
Oh, yes. I worked in Spain, not lived and worked, but certainly worked in Spain,
Yes.
in Peru, in Buenos Aires, Argentina,
Yes.
in Santiago de Chile,
Ah.
and of course, in Mexico, which is
Yeah.
so near, in Puerto Rico as well,
Wow.
and Colombia.
And how would you compare cultures between, let's say, Spain, Europe, and Mexico or Argentina in South America?
Oh, there are great differences. Number one, in the way the language is spoken,
Okay.
the Spanish language, and that, of course, depends on what the substratum is. And of course, in Latin America, in the north of South America, it will be the languages of Quechua and Quichua as a substratum,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And in Argentina, we get more of the flavor of Italian immigration, which is 19th and 20th century. And in the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, for example, you get the fast Caribbean Spanish, which is yet different. And Mexican Spanish for me always has a lovely lilt. And perhaps that's because it was the first experience abroad that I had.
Wonderful. Okay, so who have been your most significant academic influence and mentor throughout your career in academia?
That's a great question. And it's one that I do believe I can answer. I'm going to start with the academic answer, which is John Murra, who was a Romanian-born indigenous, that is, ethnohistorian and ethnologist of the Andean region.
Right.
And he was a formidable influence precisely because he wasn't in my own discipline of literary studies.
Yes.
And we looked at things, at the world that we studied differently.
Ah, okay.
And so I was able to learn a lot about his perspective at the same time as I tried to explain mine to him and fine-tune that.
Yes.
Another great influence was an early professor of mine when I was in graduate school at Cornell University. This is the early 1970s.
Yes.
And this was Professor Roberto González Echevarría. And many years later, indeed, decades later, I became here his colleague.
Oh, wonderful.
At Yale.
Yeah.
And that was starting in the second half of the 1990s and for the 25 years that I was on faculty.
Right.
Well, at this point, he's a great friend, but he is a great mind in the field of literary studies, be it Latin American, be it Spanish. He has tremendous breadth. The third is really the very most important one. And this is my late husband, David Adorno.
Right.
He taught me how to appreciate both of those mentors in their different ways. And he also was my advisor throughout my academic career. And because you see, he was older than I was. He was 15 years older. He was a mathematician.
Yes.
He did his PhD at Harvard in mathematics, and he was on the faculty at New York University and ended his career at the State University of New York in Binghamton, which is now called Binghamton University.
I see.
So that was my surest and really lifelong guide. And I still follow his advice.
Right. And was there, how did you manage to break the differences between you and your husband, since he is a mathematician, you are you're in humanities. So how were those differences between both of you?
That's a good question, too. First of all, he was always a great appreciator of the humanities. I can see that you are as well.
I am. It's correct.
And he said, well, I can't go out socially and expect people to talk about topology or stochastic processes.
Yes, yes.
So he said, I've always been interested in the humanities.
Right.
And that is a true, true thing.
Wonderful.
And that helped me to be very open-minded myself, looking at other disciplines, feeling that there was always much I could learn from them.
I mean, it is a famous saying that differences attract each other. So it's a well-established fact.
Good. I'm glad that it is. I won't have to theorize about it then.
Right.
Because, you know, there is that way of looking at the world that is so different. We do it in metaphors.
Yes. And
mathematicians do it in symbolic language, but it's not metaphors.
Right.
The way that I understand them.
Right.
So I think we both speak additional languages, figurative in our case of the humanities, symbolic in the case of mathematics, if I may say so.
Yes, and science says that we are using different parts of our brain for equations, for mathematical logic, than we do for literature, for humanities. Do you think that's true?
Well, I'm no theorist on that topic, but I would say it probably is.
Yes. Okay. So what do you consider to be the most significant achievements or moments in your academic career?
I think the most I can count began at the very beginning, and that is when I took up the study of an indigenous Andean writer, Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, about whom you know.
Yes.
And he was his book, which is called New Chronicle and Good Government in English, but it's Nueva Crónica y Buen Gobierno, was taken as a source of information about the pre-Columbian Andes, economically, socially, politically, and also as a source of information about the Spanish colonial era. But I looked at the work not as a collection of notes meant to be used by researchers as such, but rather as a single and coherent book.
Okay.
And to see something in that light is a very different thing.
Right.
New Chronicle of what? His interpretation, both imagined and studied, of Andean and particularly Inca history.
Yes.
His good government, it was a common phrase in Spanish in its day. Good government meant this would be a treatise on how to govern better.
Right.
Viceregal
makes sense.
Peru.
Makes sense.
Yes. So I worked very hard to see it as a single coherent book. And I think I made that point.
Right.
And so I consider that my biggest contribution. It was probably the most hard-earned scholarly contribution that I've made.
Right. Would you say that he is the most significant Latin writer in the history?
Oh, well, now that's another good question. I will give you Jorge Luis Borges.
Okay.
He was a writer of short stories and of poetry, both very imaginative and very, very learned.
Right.
And I have just sent to one of my new friends in Spain, as a matter of fact, new friends, someone I just met a few years ago, in fact, 2 years ago, sent her some of Borges' short stories. I said, this would be. And she wrote back to me and said, oh, I thought you would suggest to me a North American writer. I said, well, unless you're ready for William Faulkner.
Okay. So it takes time to get ready to this. Yeah. So what do you consider your most important contributions to the field of Latin American studies?
I think just, it's my attempt to be an example of somebody who is historically responsible and yet capable of reading with a literary eye. And I think that's a kind of bifocal view that that I've always tried to take. And I think of that as a contribution. Whether it's appreciated or not, only readers can tell me that, right?
Right.
Yes.
That's the most
But
important thing.
yes, but just to provide the example, hopefully in English as well as in Spanish, of clear, coherent writing and ideas that can be studied and reproduced,
Right.
and the way of working, as I say. Yes.
I see. Wonderful. How has your methodological approach to studying colonial Latin American literature evolved over the years?
Yes. Well, I think it's evolved in this way. Because I have studied colonial texts in that era, I have really come to understand the contradictions or positions and counterpositions that someone living in a colonial situation is always confronted by.
Yes.
And that boils down to living in a situation in which mistrust of one is the most common experience.
Right.
Mistrusted by perhaps old relatives who don't speak Spanish and you do. Mistrusted by Spanish speakers who know that you speak Quechua and they don't. Once you cross a linguistic barrier, as he was able to do, as Guaman Poma was able to do, then you always see that you're in relationships that may be opposed to one another. And that's why I say that mistrust is the most common characteristic of colonialism as I've learned it through my study. And that's been an evolving understanding. I can say that, to understand it intellectually, but it takes more than that to understand it affectively.
Right.
And that, I think, is what I would hope helps me understand others whose languages and cultures are different than my own.
Do you have interest in other languages or literature on other languages, for example, European languages or some other than Spanish? And
I certainly do.
Ones?
Well, of course, there's always a little bit of Latin to be learned.
Yes.
Given the period in which I work, and French, of course, and Italian, which sometimes comes easy. But to tell you the very truth, I've spent my whole academic life since I was 19 years old trying to master Spanish more competently. So I'm not the polyglot that we used to see in generations before mine in the academic world. Not an Erich Auerbach, for example.
I see.
No.
How similar is Italian to Spanish language? Can Italians understand Spanish people when they're talking?
Yes.
Yes. So it's quite similar language.
They're close enough. And if not understood verbally, that is orally, they can be understood in writing a little better. What isn't so obvious is the understanding of Portuguese, which of course we occupy the Iberian Peninsula, both Spanish and Portuguese. And I thought in my early days that one could, of course, understand Portuguese. So I went to a restaurant when I was in Lisbon, a local restaurant, and I ordered what I thought was chicken. Pollo.
Pollo, yes.
Well, it turned out to be pulpo, octopus.
Oh, really?
Yes, really octopus. And I made a false comparison there. So what came out was a tentacle, a boiled tentacle of octopus with the suction cup sitting on top, and it was curled around the potatoes and the green beans. And I'm sitting there wondering what to do, and the neighbors at the other tables are laughing because they understand that I didn't know what I was doing.
And how come Portuguese is such different than Spanish and Italian is so similar to Spanish? So I suppose that Portuguese and Spanish have different origins than Italian and Spanish. So what are the differences in origins of Portuguese and Spanish?
I think the real difference tends to be in the background of the Castilian language in Spain, which has already many varieties,
Yes.
the Old Castilian of the north and the Andalusian Spanish of the south, versus going farther west into Portugal. There are other influences as well. So it's those influences that come either from abroad or from the indigenous, that is the native background of those places, that does take a toll.
I see.
Yeah.
So is it true that Columbus was the first Spanish to discover Latin America?
Yes, it's true.
It's true.
It's true. But you know, Columbus himself is an interesting case because he was Genoese. And he didn't come from a family of navigators.
Okay.
So, but he became a navigator, and then he thought he would be able to sell his services to the monarchs of Portugal.
Ah, really?
And he spent some years there, but he had no luck. So he went to Spain, and Ferdinand and Isabella, who had just, shall I say, retaken Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, launched him on his trip. So he writes a lot. Naturally, he writes his travel logs and so forth in Spanish, but remember, he's never studied Spanish formally.
Oh, okay.
Not Portuguese formally.
Yes.
He speaks some dialect from Italian.
Oh, so he's all
So,
mixed up.
so you can see the confluences of many influences on his work.
Right.
But he does take the credit, of course, that we know in the great first map that we have, it was speculative by Waldseemüller, that the German, that it was, he named America for Amerigo Vespucci.
Yes.
And that's how the name stuck. And that's fine, because Vespucci was right there too. And of course, the Portuguese were great, great navigators.
Yes.
I think that's why Columbus worked with them for them for some years beforehand. The 15th century, you couldn't top the Portuguese. That's when they developed their really far-flung worldwide empire.
Right. Is the Spanish language the most spoken language in the world?
Second, it's the second or third. It's either Chinese or Spanish that is second. Yes, and worldwide.
Yes, and English is like fourth or fifth, right? It's not close to Spanish or Chinese.
I don't keep track of English.
Yes,
funny thing.
Yes. That's interesting. Yeah.
So we'll Google it and find out. Okay.
Wonderful. Okay, so what insights have you gained from your work on Felipe Guaman de Ayala, and why do you think his work remains significant even these days?
Oh, I think it remains highly significant these days, and that is for the reason that here is a person who lived under colonialism, which was both political and economic and social.
Yes.
And how many places in the world can we count today where we have a situation where the dominant society is not the one to which one is native, where one lives.
Yes, you're right. Right. And what is his background, his roots, his education?
Well, his education was mostly that he was self-taught. He was an autodidact. But he learned what he learned of Spanish from missionary friars who recruited him probably as an adolescent to seek out those practitioners of traditional Andean religion, the solar religion of the Incas or the local religions of the regions. So he was recruited to be an informant against his own people. Let's start with that, right? To develop a situation of that's very, very difficult to live in. And so then, with the help of some of these missionary friars, I am convinced, because he couldn't have done it alone, he was able to get his hands on books, books written in Spanish, and that those were his other teachers.
Right.
And that is really what made him who he is. Of course, his Spanish is such that those people who do know Quechua language can read the substratum of Quechua in it by the formation of his syntax.
I see.
And the problem when Spanish was first written down, Quechua was first written down, it was just a few decades after the Spanish arrived. So there would be, let's say, the sounds of Quechua. There might be 5 or 7 sounds or phonemes in Quechua, and the Spanish transcribed them all with the single letter C.
Really? So
yes. So even to interpret written Quechua after it was written down in the 16th century requires a highly trained linguist in the Quechua language today.
Yes. And what would you say, what was the influence of Catholic Church to Spanish literature over the history?
Well, it was a visible influence because one had to proclaim Spanish faith, Spanish Catholic faith, I mean to say, Catholic Orthodox faith.
Right.
So we will never know what indigenous authors like Guaman Poma really believed. We only know what they say in writing.
Yes.
We can see what they were expressing. In the same way that you and I may not, how would we know one another's truest beliefs?
Right.
Whatever I say to you or you say to me may be partially true.
Right, that is correct. Okay, so how do colonial texts reflect the complexities of cultural exchange and identity formation in early Latin America?
Very, very much so. Identity formation was a very, very hard thing to achieve. If, as we were just saying, one had to profess Roman Catholicism and at the same time desiring to remain true to one's own ethnic heritage, that right there puts a big question mark in front of identity formation. It was not simple. It was probably more complex than it is today. But having said that, I may say, well, is that really true? I'm not sure.
Yes. To what degree would you say that the Spanish language is present in the United States?
Well, it is the second most frequently spoken language in this country that we know.
Yes.
And because it is spoken by people who are native and or that's one category we could talk about, then we could split that up at the level of education and literacy, reading, and so forth. And then we can also look at the younger generation who are heritage speakers of Spanish, who may speak it very well, likely to speak it the way it's spoken by their mother and father at home. That's another matter. So it's a great, I would say, an enormously interesting and complex reality or realities of the Spanish language in this country today.
I see. Right. So how do you approach the study of mestizo writers within the colonial framework and what unique challenges does this present?
It always presents the challenge of trying to understand as much as one can from the outside and partially from the inside what their cultural background really was, where they fit into history. Do they just fit into a colonial Spanish history, into a regional ethnic history, into a local
so there
history.
are many separations and many divisions there.
Yes, very, very many.
Yes, I see. Right. Okay, so how can interdisciplinary approaches enhance our understanding of colonial Latin American literature?
I'm going to start by saying that to be truly interdisciplinary demands a level of training, of study and training, and I don't mean superficially or trivially, to work through the materials and methods of another discipline. Very few of us do that. So the way I look at it, what we call interdisciplinary in the humanities, if that element is missing, is that we work from within a single language with the studies and the results of other disciplines and learn from them. And those then incorporated into our own understanding of what our subject and what our discipline is.
I see. Yeah. So one field has to depend on other fields if we want to get the whole picture, the big picture. Basically.
Yes, I really believe that. So that in that way, everybody should be what we could say is having an interdisciplinary outlook, which really means open to the learning of other disciplines. Now, there are a few exceptions to this, of course, but I'm just talking more generally here.
Right. In what ways would you say that the issues in colonial Latin American literature resonate with contemporary society?
Oh, well, the themes are many. The themes are oppression, or let me not put it so strongly, we can say subjugation.
Okay.
And that will be either, it can be politically, it can be economically, socially.
Social, yes.
And that's a very, very big thing. The other one regarding themes, I would say that one always looks, the writing subject always looks to gain cultural prestige, which is to say authority, authority to be a speaker on a particular subject.
Right. So how do you approach teaching colonial Latin American to new students?
Well, that's always an interesting challenge. And over my almost 50 years of teaching, this challenge has changed over time, as you may well imagine.
Right.
So we are now at the moment where we start with where the student is, not with where the professor is.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. Yes.
Good. And so the way I always think about it is I have the students do an exercise to get them familiar with studying somebody else's experience in a different time period, which is what we do. And I do this generally over the Thanksgiving break by saying, when you go home to your families, you should ask your elders, be they parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, not your peers, your elders, about their experiences in life.
Right.
And if they don't want to tell you, you back off. You don't say a word. You say thank you very much anyway.
Right.
And if they do, you'll know that they feel very important and flattered to be asked, delighted to be asked about their own experiences, which young people do not share.
Yes.
And they come back from the Thanksgiving break because, of course, I have them write something up about what they have experienced. And I think that always helps them understand when you reach for another person's experience in the previous generation or in the previous centuries, you're always facing the challenge of learning something about which you know nothing.
I agree. Do you know how many PhD students did you have throughout your career?
I think it numbers about 25.
Okay.
It has given me the chance, and indeed 2 of them are deceased, but it gave me the chance to really work with students and help them become who they would become, reading very carefully everything that they write. And of course, clear and coherent writing is always a very top priority with graduate students, whether it's in Spanish or in English, of course. My husband, who studied mathematics initially at the University of Texas with a professor named R.L. Moore, and my husband was a returning GI, having served in World War II and the Korean War, was Professor Moore told his students, I'm giving you these bits of information, and I want you to develop the theory.
Exactly. Yeah. So.
And that was perfect for somebody who was slightly more mature. And David, my husband, always told me that many of R.L. Moore's students tried to duplicate it and never could, because it was the magic of the individual.
Right. What do you see as the future directions or emerging trends in Latin American studies?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball.
Yes, of course.
But I do have hopes. So if I may speak instead about how I see the future, but what I hope for the future,
of course.
Yes, I will. And that certainly is to find students who are always more and more equipped to take on the big challenges. But first, they have to be aware that they're not going to take a literary theory, let's say, and put it on top of a piece of writing. Rather, the writing itself, this is a little like Professor Shankar's approach. The ideas have to emerge from that text. And that gives a student something to work with. But that's where it starts.
Right.
That's exactly where it starts. In my humble hopes.
So what advice do you have for young scholars just entering the field of Latin American literature?
Oh, well, I tell them, be sure that you love what you do. Don't take this up as a strategic idea, a strategy for a career. It can never be that, because that will lead you nowhere. You have to feel passionately about what you are studying, because only then will it give you the drive and the motivation to carry on and on and on. And your thinking will evolve, but it's not going to be hatched, fully mature, full grown. And the other thing is not to work only just with one's own particular project, but to have a knowledge of the field in general and of its landmarks. It's unfashionable to talk about literary canons, but when a young person goes out on the job market in the humanities, they'll often be asked, aha, I see. Well, you do colonial. Oh, could you teach a medieval course for us? And that then relies on the training that they have had in their graduate program.
I see.
And I had a student once who came to me at the Modern Language Association annual meeting, and she said, she was a medievalist, and she said, thank goodness, Professor Adorno, I took your course, because I was able to say, here's what I would do if I had to teach a colonial course.
How difficult is to enter Yale as a graduate student or a master's student to study Latin American literature?
Having not done it myself, I don't know. But I do know that we look very carefully from the side of the faculty. I can tell you this. We look very carefully at the applications, and we debate and discuss them at great length. What our limitations are the number of appointments that the graduate school allows us to make. And that means here at Yale, they're fully funded. So that means fully funded for 5 years for sure, if not 6 now. And that means that the resources aren't endless, and we have to be very careful in making our choices. I have learned over the years or experience that really makes one very, very careful. And reading through the materials that the student presents and reading around them as well.
And how big is the Department of Latin American Studies here at Yale?
Well, Latin American Studies is a program, not a department.
I see.
So many departments figure into what a Latin American Studies major would be. So the department's history, for example, is a very large department,
Yes.
but the number of Latin Americanists in it is a handful. And here in my own Spanish department, Spanish and Portuguese department,
Yes.
we're again a handful or two of people who are full faculty members
I see.
in the literature.
Yes.
And from these departments, and this includes environmental studies, it includes art history, as well as art history and Spanish and Portuguese. It includes other considerations as well to make up a Latin American studies major. But they have to have a modicum of the languages of Spanish and Portuguese.
I see. I understand. Okay, so can you share an example of a particularly rewarding experience you have had working with students? Something that just entered your mind and stayed there forever?
Yes, I would say, and this is seemingly a superficial example, but it goes with the way we do things today. In one of my classes, which was a course in Latin American cultural history, I wanted to know from this group of 35 to 40 students if there were any special talents that they had that fit into the Latin American cultural circumstance. And I had one young lad who, as a matter of fact, had a musical group and they played Caribbean music.
Oh, wow.
So I said, okay, then from you, we'll make a special day and we'd like for you to teach us Caribbean musical rhythms.
Wonderful.
That was wonderful.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, Latin America culture is well known for dancing, for music, for I mean, they have invented so many popular dances like tango, right?
In Argentina,
Argentina, and then rumba, salsa. They're all Spanish-like dances. So they're.
And they don't come from Spain. If there's any foreign influence, any other influence, it is African. And we have to remember that African slavery was predominant in in Spain, but coming into the Americas, as here in this country, as we well know, and also, of course, into the Caribbean and Latin America. So much of this wonderful influence does have an African root or roots.
I see.
The same way that Caribbean cuisine has African roots. There's one marvelous essay, that's another very, very fine moment of teaching in which the students learned that a particularly common or popular dish in Cuba had elements that were African, that were native Taino, that were Spanish, and what else may I add? But it's a beautiful essay, and it's written exactly on that topic of what makes something, and that tells you right there, we're in already a mixture of cultures that on the table harmonize very well.
Right. Have you ever been to Cuba?
I haven't.
You haven't. I mean, isn't like Cuba is nowadays one of the best examples of Latin culture because there's still this communism there, and they kind of kept their origins, maybe more than Mexico or I don't know, some other Latin American countries.
Well, that's a very conflicted question. Because the people who really live in Cuba, who are not part of the leadership, have very, very difficult lives.
Yes, I know that.
Yeah, and I have friends who, and former students, who find it very difficult to support their relatives when they can, sending dollars or visiting, but they live in a very, very very underprivileged situation. even people who work in the National Library, for example, who are educated, right? Yes, yes,
And
yes.
they are just looking a way to get out of the country, basically to escape.
If they could.
If they could.
If they
Yes,
could.
yes.
If I may say something else about Cuba, this puts a more humorous light on it, I think, which is always good. I was appointed by President Barack Obama to the National Council on the Humanities.
Okay.
This is a presidential appointment, and the presidential commission is signed by the president and the Secretary of State. At the time, that was Hillary Clinton.
Yes.
That comes after a long FBI investigation of one's background. And part of that investigation was not only to recount every single place I'd ever lived and, you know, quite an extensive background check, what foreign countries I had visited and what relationships I had in them. And this was the only place where I could say it was fortunate that I had not been to Cuba, because this would have brought an extra level of scrutiny, which I could have survived. That's not a problem. But still, it just tells you that this was it's still very, very problematic. Of course, I have colleagues and I have former students who take study groups to Cuba now. And that's a wonderful and good thing.
Yes. Have you ever met President Barack Obama in person?
Yes, I have.
Yes, and what is he like?
He's somebody who can talk off script.
Okay.
And not sound foolish.
Yes, yes.
May I give you one example?
Please do.
Okay. This is at one of the ceremonies for the bestowal of the National Humanities Medals and the National Medals of the Arts. The president not only is the final selector of those awards, but he is also the presenter. And there is a script. A Marine officer will read the introduction of the individual. The individual walks up on the platform stage in the East Room of the White House.
Yes.
The president has a medal on a ribbon and places it around their neck. And then he may say a few remarks.
Yes.
But the year that I recall so specifically is when an honorary medal of the humanities was given to Ted Sorensen, who had been a speechwriter for John F. Kennedy.
Wow.
Another one was Robert Caro.
Okay.
He's the great historian of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy in the presidency. So after it's all said and done, the president, as people are moving around wherever they have to in the East Room, he's saying, well, you know, there was Robert Caro, from whom I learned everything I learned about politics. And then there was Ted Sorensen, who used up all the good words for all time. And that was the phrase attributed to him of ask not what you can do for your country.
Yes.
Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And I thought that was really brilliant. And then my colleague, Roberto González Echevarria, got a medal, a National Humanities Medal. And on that occasion, after the formal ceremony, the President and Mrs. Obama receive in a private reception the medal winners and their families. So Professor González Echevarria, and you're in a receiving line. By the time you get to the president, your name may be spoken in 5 different ways. None of them match you, right?
Yeah, I know how
you know that.
How it feels, yeah.
and so Professor González Echevarria was apologizing. He said, I'm sorry, I have a complicated name. And the president said, that's all right. Until a couple of years ago, nobody could get my name right either.
Exactly.
So that's Barack Obama.
Wonderful. Okay, so I have just a couple of more questions. What challenges have you faced during your career, and how have you overcome them?
Well, there have been many challenges, I'd say. And I've always overcome them with the help and advice of my very experienced academic husband. May I give an example, or do we have time?
Please.
Well, this was coming up to my first job. I had my PhD from Cornell University. I had a couple of publications in very respectable places, and I applied for and was appointed to a position at my first university. I'm not going to name it because I feel great loyalty to it. I was there for 9 whole years. However, this is what happened with the initial appointment. I was called by the chair of the department, and I was told, "Congratulations, Mrs. Adorno. We're offering you the position." I thought Dr. Adorno would have been appropriate, but well, anyway. And so he said, but now I have to tell you what the job description said, Mr. Kukina. The job description said this will be a tenure track, 3-year appointment for an assistant professor. The salary will be in a range between $12,000 and $14,000. This tells you that it's a half a century ago.
Yes,
right.
So it was a big salary for that
right.
time. Yes.
Right. So I'm called, and Mrs. Adorno was told, "We're offering you the position. It will be non-tenure track. It will be 1 year only. Well, possibly renewable. And the salary will be $12,000. And I said, I was aghast, and I said, "Thank you. I'll have to think about that.
Yes.
Thank you." And I got off the phone and I said to my husband, David, "What will I do?" He said, "Well, I can give you 2 answers. The first is, you don't have a position right now, so you are not in a position to bargain for one.
Right.
The second piece of advice is, take it. You'll show them."
Right. And how come that your first offer was so different than the second one?
Well, because what happened then was that by the second year, by the end of the first year, they realized that I was very productive. I was teaching 3 courses a semester. That was probably, let's not even count up the number of students. So they thought, well, yes, they would then hire me on the tenure track. And so they did. I stayed there for 9 years. I was tenured there, and I was promoted to the rank of associate professor. And so I feel very loyal to the institution.
And the final question, what would you like to be remembered for? For your teaching, for your papers, for your studies, for your something?
I guess I would like to be remembered for my teaching, and I have some indications of that right now, and from my former students, and I would like my academic work to be cited from time to time. I'm going to close with my personal idea of immortality, secular immortality, not spiritual immortality. The first piece of this is to either bear or to raise children. The second is to leave a good recipe, a favorite recipe for cooking, so that that will be its own legacy in future generations.
And what is your favorite recipe?
And well, that would take a long time to talk about. And then the third is to be remembered by having written a book.
Right. And from all of your books, which one are you most proud of?
The first and the last.
Okay.
The first was called Guaman, Poma, Writing and Resistance in Colonial Peru. And it was exactly about Guaman, Poma. And the last one is called The Polemics of Possession in Spanish American narrative. And that is to take the series of possession in the sense of territorial possession.
Yes, I see.
Possession in the sense of cultural prestige.
Yes.
And what I did was take one writer who was read by another, who was read by another, who was read by another, so there would be a chain of continuity from one to the other,
Yes.
both in reading and in writing, and ending, in fact, with novels of the 20th century, making reference to the colonial period. That's the one I would really like to be remembered by also. Just those two.
Do you have any more plans for maybe writing another book?
Well, isn't that funny that you should ask?
Okay.
Well, because somebody asked me that just yesterday, and this is a colleague at the University of Virginia. I'm not saying no, but I have the luxury of thinking about it more. And my idea, if I follow through, would be to do something on the Baroque period in Latin America. The Baroque is a constant presence in Latin America, both in art and in writing, in writers of today, and of course, in the 17th century itself. And that's a very rich domain because writers from Italy, from Spain, from Mexico, were all in the same conversation group, as I might say.
Yes.
They were writing in the vernacular then, but they were all reading in Latin still.
Yes.
So there were many conversations that could be traced in that regard.
Do you know Latin?
Not well enough to do a study of Latin works.
Yes.
No, absolutely not. We have some colonialists who are doing that, and that is so very much needed.
Right.
Yes.
Yes. Professor Adorno, this is the end of the conversation. Is there maybe something you would like to say for the end to our viewers, to our audience? Maybe some final message?
No, your questions have been so stimulating.
Thank you very much.
And so probing that I really have nothing left to say.
Wonderful.
I appreciate very much having this interview with you.
I really enjoyed this conversation, discussing several topics with you. Thank you for that.
Then the thanks are mutual.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.